Okay, for this reflection, so we're supposed to identify the stage of identity development we're in, describe why we think we're in that stage, and then say like how we can move forward from this and how it might affect students that we're teaching. So I was looking at the white racial identity development model, and I kind of saw parts of myself in three different phases. So I thought I'm partially still a little bit in the disintegration phase, which is pretty close to the beginning, mostly because it talked about feeling like shame and guilt for your identity. And then I feel like I'm still kind of beginning to consciously come to terms with my identity, just as I'm like leaving where I grew up, and even after this leaving college. So I feel like that part of me is still in that phase. And then I think another small part of me is in like the immersion phase, which is farther along, because I do think I am like trying to be anti-racist and reflect on my own identity more, and I do want to find other people that are doing the same thing and learn from them and work with them. And then I also do feel like I have more of like an effective emotional understanding, but I am still lacking the experiential portion that it talks about in that phase. And so overall, I think I'm mostly in this independence phase. I think I'm starting to understand like white privilege, bias, prejudice, discrimination, all these things, but it definitely does, it has stayed at more of an intellectual level for now because it's really just through like classes at school that I'm learning about it and not really through my own experiences yet. This stage talked a little bit about like feeling like whites don't deserve privilege, and I think that fits into the guilt from the earlier stage that I talked about feeling. And I think I'm in this stage because I do recognize these other experiences that people are having, but it is still challenging for me to see my role in creating change as someone who hasn't experienced these things. And yeah, the same thing, like coming to terms with being white and non-racist at the same time is something that I'm still struggling with, just as I'm really first becoming aware of like these different tensions with my identity. So then talking about like some feelings I had while doing this activity, I've already discussed a little bit guilt, just feeling like guilty for still not being fully developed in my identity, and that some of me is still really close to the beginning of this development, and it's I feel guilty because like I haven't had to really come to terms with this, which isn't an option for a lot of people, so there's a lot of privilege in that, and I also think it's really hard to see like how I'm going to move on to the next step in the identity development until it happens. I feel like it's not something that I can really plan out. It's just something that will happen as I'm more exposed to things. So it's hard to like see myself moving forward, which is difficult too. And then another feeling that I had was confusion. It's a little hard to come to terms with like being in multiple stages at the same time, so trying to find those connections was difficult. And then the third one was surprise, which some parts of me are really farther along than I expected just because of my background and where I've grown up. So that kind of plays into some of the assumptions I had. So first I assumed that I would be further back in the process, like overall, maybe not as far back as that first stage, but not fully developed at all. And I feel like this assumption was wrong mostly because just because I am past the phase of like colorblindness or blaming the victim, that kind of thing, which is more the first couple phases of this. And I think that like being having the availability of like classes at college here, or the availability of looking through news, being able to read scholarly articles, I think that's all helped me move forward in this process. I think from my prior experiences, the reasons that I'm not so fully developed in my identity is because, as I've talked about in my other reflections, that I grew up in such an isolated place, didn't really recognize race in my daily experiences, and I think the education here has definitely helped, especially like showing why colorblindness isn't a good thing, and then also helping me reflect on my own identity and find ways to do this productively. I also think that although I grew up in a really isolated place, it was more democratic than the rest of the state, so I was more aware of these things happening and the inequities, and then the same thing for my parents, what they focus on and believe, what news they talk to us about, that kind of thing, I think influenced my identity growing up. And then another assumption I had was just kind of that like for a while I believed that if it wasn't explicitly racist, it was fine. And reading through these identity descriptions, I think has changed this, because I've come to realize, like, if you're not actively doing something against it, it's not fine, because that's not helpful. And if you just accept and you understand, like, oh yes, this is happening, but you aren't doing anything to change that, then it's not, like, good, it's not okay, and we need to be working to dismantle it. I think this is one of the biggest portions of the further along identity phases, because it's like working to be anti-racist and recognizing your role in that, even if you're not necessarily experiencing the racism and discrimination. So I think a lot of this came from prior experiences too, just not seeing much racial interaction, growing up in an isolated area with people that expressed really democratic views, but it was hard to really see that in action, because in these scenarios. So I feel like everyone would be like, yes, like, racism is bad, but so then no one was explicitly racist, then I assumed everything was okay, but a lot of people weren't really doing anything about it, and so I think that's where this new understanding has kind of come in. I didn't really see my role in the change, because I didn't really have to think about it, I didn't have to do anything about it growing up. And then it was, just like dominant narratives. What I heard growing up was that racism is like an explicit thing, like saying that another race is bad, not necessarily like implicit bias or just like accepting the way things are or anything like that. So I think this definitely impacts my teaching in a lot of ways. I think especially with biases, especially implicit, because I feel like I'm careful, like, explicitly what I'm doing, but implicitly they just come up, and it's hard to recognize those, I guess, and then change them. So I think this is shown through, like, what I assume students know. So my teacher talks about, like, one time when she was teaching a math lesson, and it talked about rafters, like, in a building, and she just was talking, and all of a sudden she turned around and everyone looked so confused, even though they'd already done this math, and she came to realize that they didn't know what that word meant. And so that's one of the things that I think I have to be really careful about, just because I'm not so far along in my identity development. So recognizing different experiences that students have and don't have from me, and making sure to explain those fully. And then also in, like, discipline and teaching strategies, recognizing that students come from different cultures. So if I have a student of a different identity and I assume that what they're doing is bad, my teacher put it this way, like, do you think this shouldn't be happening because it's not supposed to happen, or because you're not used to it or comfortable with it? So I think bringing that into it is really important. And then also she talked a little bit about biases with grading, which I think is important to think about, especially, like, unconscious biases. So she says what she does is she goes through, she has, like, all the papers, she goes through one question for all of them to make sure she's taking off points on the same things, and she also doesn't put the papers in any order, so there's no names attached, so there can't really be any unconscious biases for certain students. So I think those are important. I think just, like, feeling uncomfortable or unsafe myself in an environment, so and making sure that I recognize if that's just, like, a bias I have that is not, like, founded in anything, and trying to overcome that. And like, unconsciously catering to people who look more like me through my teaching strategies. And then I feel like it could also go too far in the opposite direction and being harder on people that look like me, because I'm trying so hard to be more equitable and to overcome any identity differences. And then finally, I think this can affect teaching through, like, the deficit perspective and feeling bad for students because I recognize that they have different experiences than me, and then, like, making it too easy on them, assuming they don't know how to do anything, and then not letting them learn or overcome anything. So I think to move forward, I want to continue learning about and taking classes about this kind of, like, identity stuff, positionality, do some extra readings on it, that kind of stuff. I think also professional development opportunities will help, especially more with, like, culturally responsive pedagogy. That kind of stuff definitely goes into this identity reflection piece. My own reflection, and then also feedback from administration, other teachers, students, that kind of thing as I'm student teaching and then real teaching, just to reflect on what I'm doing well and not doing well, and then just in general, like, increasing the experiences that I'm having, so that I'm able to see these things. I think this includes, like, risk taking, going outside of my, like, comfort zone and, like, the bubble that I'm used to see these different things. And then I think that honestly doing this activity was already a little bit of growth, because now I'm able to recognize where I'm at and, like, where I can change in the future, and where I need to focus these efforts.